Welcome everybody. It's a real privilege and honour to introduce to you Dr. Philippa Velija, who is one of our associate professors within the faculty and a real key driver of research, not only in the faculty but also across the university. And as a faculty, this is our first opportunity to showcase some of the work that we've been doing. And I'm sure the intriguing title has whetted our appetite. And so it's my absolute pleasure to hand you over now to Philippa. Thanks, Philippa.
Thanks, Di, and welcome everybody to this session, and thank you very much for taking the time to come along to the session today. So the title of my lecture is "Their Bottoms Are the Wrong Shape and Other Sporting Myths," and the purpose of today's session is to look at the role of myths in gender relations, both from historic and contemporary perspective. The lecture title was inspired by Rachel Blackmore's recent epic Grand National win and my own research. Blackmore was the first female jockey to win the most famous state steeplechase in the world. And as I watched live with my two girls, we were willing her to win. I will admit we did have a small bet on, but regardless of this, I would have still been shouting at the television. And afterwards, calmly explaining to the girls the significance of this, and that women had been banned from having a professional national hunt licence until 1976. Post-race, this got me thinking about my previous research with jockeys and some of the fascinating issues this research explored about gender in horse racing, the role of the horse and ideas and myths. And I started reconsidering this research and themes that emerged from my other research over the last 15 years. So my research has focused on understanding gender relations in sport, including cricket, female jockeys, gender and PE, gender and sport governance, and more recently on lad cultures and the gender pay gap. And through this research, some common themes emerge, which include myths about women's bodies, a forgotten history of women's involvement in sport, and the way in which women in established and outsider groups negotiate access to sport and how this changes over time. So what are myths? Myths are commonly accepted ways of thinking. They may be supported by some tangible knowledge about a topic and issue, but more importantly for today's lecture, what's the significance of myths, and how might we understand their significance and relevance in power relations more broadly? I am a sociologist, and my research has been very much informed by the sociology of Norbert Elias. And in What is Sociology, he has a chapter on the sociologist as a destroyer of myths. I loved reading this as a master's student. I was already so fortunate to be at the Centre for Research into Sport and Society with some amazing scholars. And reading this book gave me reassurance about the potential power of sociology, which asks critical and challenging questions and could help me reflect on sport and other areas of life so differently. Elias's broader sociology of knowledge explores how myths, gossip and knowledge are interlinked. More specifically, he considers how knowledge is constructed in specific relationships, encouraging us to ask, how do we come to know, as well as how have humans produced and used knowledge over time? So from this viewpoint, if we take the quote, "Their bottoms are the wrong shape," about female jockeys, the question is less about whether this is true, but rather how and why knowledge is produced, shared and used, and by whom. So I structure this lecture around three mythical ways of thinking to challenge us to think about the ways in which knowledge about women or gender in sport are created. These are women's sport as new, current and historic myths about women's bodies, and finally, myths of equality. So the myth of women's sport being new reflects an invisible history about women in sport. And in my research, I've adopted a processual and historical approach to making visible women's involvement in sport, highlighting while there has never been a time that girls and women have not been involved in sport, there's also never been a time where their involvement has not been contested, resisted, and negotiated. And for this section, I mainly draw on my research on cricket. So cricket has, women's cricket has a long established history. Women have been playing since 1745 and were playing frequently in village matches. Now, cricket at this time was very different than the game that we know today, with different rules and would look very different. But women were involved. They played in matches of married versus maidens with prizes of ale, cake, or ribbons. Now, not all women were particularly well behaved when playing. In fact, one such match attracted attention in 1833 as it discusses the inappropriate behaviour of women, a reminder that concerns about women's behaviour, their bodies and appropriateness and how this might impact on their marriage prospects are not new. Although the game and women's involvement declined during the Victorian era in response to a parallel process of the strengthening of the relationship between masculinity, cricket and nationality, and the changing rules of the game and the role of the MCC, and what has become as quite a mythical or romantic way of seeing the men's game as well. It was cricket for women was re-established through the girls' public schools, later colleges. There was, again, resistance. This quote about cricket masculising girls and heaven forbid that they might start boxing and end up deep-voiced and with biceps. It is an ongoing concern that we see about women's bodies and a concern that girls would become too masculine. And these often draw on medical ideas that women who played sport would become masculine and potentially unable to have children. The Women's Cricket Association formed in 1926 by ladies, run by women, for girls and women. And with some visibility at this stage came resistance. And the women were aware that there was resistance to the formation of the Women's Cricket Association, so much so that they shared a letter that had been sent to them about cricket being a preposterous idea and dismay that another field of male activities was to be usurped by the fairer sex. And this idea that cricket is somehow degraded by women playing. But the fact that the Women's Cricket Association published that demonstrates an awareness of that resistance. And they responded to that in sort of two key ways. One was to ensure propriety, so that the other quote here around playing in appropriate dress was something that Women's Cricket Association were keen to stress, and they did not challenge the men's game. They were separate and did not question myths about the women's game head on. But the women's game has a long established history, a somewhat forgotten history at times. The first tour by England to Australia was in 1934, but only for those who could afford to pay the £80 to purchase equipment and to be away from home for several months. It wasn't called the Ashes at that time due to controversy over the recent Bodyline series and a desire to demarcate the game as different and separate to the men's game. But it was popular. The first match played at the famous Wacker Ground had 3,500 spectators. And there was a return series when Australia came to England in 1937. As the game developed globally, there was a need for an organising committee, and the International Women's Cricket Council was formed in 1958 by women, again, for women, and it played a significant role in the international game. The development of the IWCC and the Women's World Cup which was very much pioneered by Rachel Hayhoe-Flint. A few years ago, I was invited to talk about my book at the Yorkshire Literature Festival on women's cricket and global processes. And I was contacted by a family member of Joan Wilkinson about a book they had written about their aunt who'd played for England between 1949 and 1958, called I Had a Wizard of a Time, Her Diaries and Experiences of Playing Cricket. There are other examples of similar texts, but these tell in these histories, we find stories of women who played, toured, migrated, captained, umpired, coached and organised the game at the highest level. And cricket was very much a global game for women. It was played and organised in Pakistan, in India and other areas of the globe where myths have dominated about women not having access to sport or not being interested in playing sport. The history of most sports is therefore a partial one, and here the erasing of knowledge of women's involvement in sport supports this myth that women's sport is somewhat new. And this is not just a historic issue. What happens is we see the women's game compared to men's sport, and the knowledge we draw on and what histories we emphasise show the way that the women's game is still erased in narratives. For example, here about England winning, England win the Super Over to claim the World Cup for the first time. That's simply not true. England women have won the World Cup in 1973, 93, 2009 and 2017. And it shows us the way in which knowledge and myths are recreated in ways that might support one's version of history over another social group's version of history. So moving on to myths about women's bodies, which are also framed in ways in which women's bodies are different, but difference is also considered as inferior and relationally superior in terms of men's bodies for sport. These reflect what Elias called a social fund of knowledge that is created between unequal social groups and highlights the way in which ideas about the female body are discussed, accepted, retold, and how reinforcing differences reinforces hierarchies. In discussing this myth, I draw on a range of research that I've undertaken over my years. So the old horseman saying here, men fall like boiled eggs and women fall like raw eggs, highlights in our research on female jockeys that this was a commonly held perception that women were more likely to be injured if they fell from a horse. This meant that some horses were deemed as unsuitable for women, while other horses were perceived as more suitable for women. Here the knowledge was confirmed somehow by a perception that horses know the gender of the rider, reflecting the ways in which myths can be confirmed by seemingly observing behaviours and commonly accepted ways of thinking. But these myths are not just comical, and in the case of female jockeys, there are lots of examples in other sports, this way of thinking actually meant that women were banned from being involved in certain sports. And more recently, there still remain debates about women being able to access particular sports. What's interesting to consider is how these myths are also internalised by women and the ways in which the gendered female body becomes reduced to biological natural difference. And these are examples of when Elias talks about forms of praise and blame gossip, whereby gossip is utilised to confirm beliefs and myths, but are also internalised by different social groups. The concern over the protection of women's bodies was particularly evident in our research on women in the martial arts, which shows that myths about women's bodies are not just historical, and debates about what forms of martial arts and boxing are suitable and what dress that women should wear in these sports are actually relatively recent. And our research with women involved in grappling, cage fighting, was prompted by my fascination with how these women were challenging myths that women were passive and not suited for fighting. In our research, it looked at a range of women's experiences of being involved in the martial arts. Women seem to defy the expectation that civilized female bodies are passive, but their involvement requires more negotiation because of the ways in which women might be perceived for their involvement in a fighting sport. And as women challenge these myths and become more involved in sport, there become other ways of controlling women's bodies, i.e. what forms of protection are necessary. So while myths about women's bodies have changed over time, they are consistent in how they emphasize difference, inferiority, and enduring in the way they are revisited to explain women's position in sport. Which brings me to the third myth of equality. Now, these are useful to see as being part of a broader process of equalization, and how relations that are rapidly moving towards equalization are those most prone to conflict. This is significant as the re-emergence of myths might tell us something about why some people resist changing gender relations, and highlight how processes of equalization are not always linear. The myths of equality are complex and they manifest themselves in different ways. And to demonstrate this, I want to draw on some current research on the gender pay gap. This is because the gender pay gap can both support and challenge myths about equality, because it simultaneously highlights the process of equalization, in which there is a growing acceptance of women working in sport, and therefore can support the notions of equality, but also may flag ongoing inequalities in gender and labour in sport sectors. The gender pay gap is calculated as the difference in the average hourly wage of all men compared to all women across an organisation, and it's publicly available since 2017, when organisations with 250 or more employees have to report this. The very existence of such a public mechanism is a visible way in which gender relations have changed over time, and its publication reflects a process of equalisation. But in my analysis of 3 sports sectors, there is a significant gender pay gap in sports national organisations, national governing bodies, and in professional clubs. The largest average gender pay gap was in professional sports clubs, with an average of 59.1% across 33 organisations. This was lower in NGBs and the publicly funded organisations, but it reflects the continual dominance of professional men's sport and men working in sport, and in areas of sport such as governance and leadership. The research also flagged in the organisation's responses to the report. So when you publish your gender pay gap, you also have to produce a report reflecting on that gap and actions that might be needed. These reports tended to emphasise and move to a position that there might be a natural explanation for why there is a gender pay gap in these sectors. In these reports, there was both a public reflection on gender pay gap, but a tendency to explain it in 2 ways. It's women's responsibility to push for equality, and maybe they don't want to work in these roles, or the re-emergence of ideas about women's bodies as reasons for ongoing inequities in labour practices. The research on the gender pay gap also links to work with colleagues on gender and curriculum on UK HE sport courses and the role of lad cultures in contemporary gender relations, where we argue the need to teach our students how to become a destroyer of myths about sport and gender when they go into the sector, so they have the skills and knowledge to be able to challenge some of the ideas around gender in sport. So before I conclude today's session, I want to bring this back to Rachel Blackmore and these images that came up when I searched for her victory in the Grand National. And in designing this lecture and looking for images and wanting to talk about particular issues, and I searched Rachel Blackmore in Google, the first thing that came up was about her boyfriend and articles about what we want to know about their relationship. Now, there were obviously articles about her winning the national as well, but these were the top Google searches. And this highlights some of the other ways in which knowledge about women in sport can be manifest. Such press coverage is significant, as are the images around this social media article. It's not just the article itself here, but the sorts of images in the pop-up ads were quite telling as well, as it highlights some of the ongoing issues for women in sport and how knowledge about women and their involvement in sport are complex, contested, accepted, and resisted. So how women's bodies and their involvement in sport are framed in myths therefore reflect broader social structure analysis of the way in which power relations influence the relative acceptance of the different exploratory accounts, and how social construction of knowledge about women's sport and their bodies highlights that we need to pay attention to the ways in which knowledge is constructed in social groups, and how that knowledge is used by who, and the ways in which it is internalized and resisted by groups. Studying power relations and gender relations can be challenging, as people may resist such critical analysis, choosing to rely on myths and knowledge that may suit their own beliefs. But perhaps we can all find comfort in Elias's conceptualization of the sociologist as being the destroyer of myths. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippa. That was really great and provocative, and I think challenging. And here you showcase your significant work and the work of colleagues in the university. So thank you so much. Really loved it. And now we're going to open it to questions either in chat or verbally, and I can't possibly manage this. So hopefully Emma and Andy can help me. So any questions, first of all, I think there's already one in the chat. No. Any questions for Philippa?
Do add your questions in the chat. Philippa, I just have one maybe to kick us off, if that's okay. I was really interested to hear you talking about the sort of link between the speed of progress towards equality and the sort of pushback that you get with that. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, and perhaps whether you thought there were some parallels with other groups at the moment.
Yeah, so I think there are parallels with other groups. I mean, one of the things that Elias talks about, and that's been quite influential in my work, is to look at these issues from this processual and historical perspective, to see how over time different relations have changed. And so in talking about sort of the lack of visibility around women's sports, if we look at Women's Cricket Association, one of the things that they did very successfully was obviously organise an international, global game. But one of the ways that they were able to do that was because they were separate. They didn't challenge the men's game. They very much were women's cricket organised by women for women. What we see in the sort of process of what Elias calls equalisation is when groups become more interdependent, so when there is more interaction between groups in that period of equalisation, there tends to be greater resistance to that. But there are also within groups, some are more accepting than others in those changing power relations. But what you tend to see are more forms of resistance, different types of forms of resistance, and then what Elias calls sort of lags in the difference between sort of changes in attitudes versus changes in behaviours.
Thank you very much, Philippa. So there's a question here from Jessie JWL. What would you say are the main barriers to women's participation in sport?
I think in terms of main barriers, I think it probably depends on the sport, though there are differences in terms of what are perceived as more or less acceptable in terms of different types of sports for women. But in some of the stuff around the myths of equality, is that these attitudes and behaviours still start very young, in preschool, in school, and this idea that, you know, boys will be boys, or there is a desire to see observable behaviours that people can then say, oh, but look, you know, that's the way that the boys are behaving, or that's the way that girls are behaving, when actually the behaviours might be quite similar, but the way we interpret the behaviours might be different. So I think even from a very early age, we have quite specific ideas around gender, which then continue throughout our lives. So I'm not sure if there's one particular barrier, but rather ways in thinking and doing that impact us throughout the way that we're socialised around sports, and they become more subtle, I think, over time, or more. There are ways of sort of making observable relations fact or mythical. I mean, the things about myths is that they tend to be observable in some way that people can demonstrate something that supports it. So I'm not sure there's one particular or main barriers, but lots of barriers that women face in sport.
That leads really nicely into our next question, Philippa, which is from Colette Adios. How can men be educated to become allies in the discussion, shifting perceptions, for example, of our students?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because actually certainly in my research, across the board actually, but it came across very, very strongly in the work that I did with young cricketers, and actually in terms of female jockeys, in that actually fathers and male role models play a significant impact in you know, encouraging girls into sport, in supporting girls in sport, in coaching, etc. So I think that's one way. I think another way, in terms of Cola's question around students, I think it's about being comfortable to challenge, and that's something that doesn't come easily, and it's certainly not something that's come easily in my career. But finding ways, I guess, of challenging quite dominant perception, because when students come to us, you know, they've already had perhaps 18 years of quite gendered sport experiences, and quite, you know, they have their own ideas, perceptions of a particular sport or experience. So I think it's about finding ways that challenge, that enable dialogue as well. Because when I first started lecturing, you know, I was, you know, probably a little bit too critical of students' views, and it sort of stops the dialogue then. And actually finding ways that we can have discussions, and useful discussions that can help us to help students to challenge the perceptions of our students, so we keep the dialogue going is probably a key one.
Yeah, I think finding that balance is tricky. There's another question here from David Wepper, who says, "Hi Philippa, really fascinating talk," which I wholeheartedly agree with. Apologies. He wants to ask, does the place of trans women in sport disrupt or perpetuate the myths that persist regarding the place and participation of cis women in sport?
I mean, I think that's a really, hot topic in terms of women in sport at the moment, and there has been some quite high profile cases, and not just about trans women, but also around intersex women and women who if we take biological sex is not a given, that there is a whole continuum of biological sex, that this idea that you're either biologically male or female is not the case. And there have been a number of individuals in sport who are classed as intersex and have fought for their participation to participate as women. Caster Semenya obviously is the probably most high profile case, but there are far more cases than that in the history of sport actually about women fighting to participate as women. In terms of Dave's question, that's a slightly different situation, because the whole premise and history of many sports is that your categorization for participation is based on whether you're male or female. And the challenge that sport has had with transgender participants, and I can see Catherine on the call, and obviously this is really her area of research. And interestingly, in those discussions about transgendered women participating in sport, there have been some very high profile cases of women athletes challenging and questioning whether people should be able to participate. And there is still a lot of work, I think, for sport to do around being inclusive to all genders and all sexualities. And there is a lot of resistance in the world of sport to people participating where the biological sex it is not clear. And that, I think that is going to be the next sort of 10 years of debates around how people and how sport respond to what is, in a broader societal context, becoming much more, much greater awareness and inclusion, and in sport is still the example of lagging behind in this area.
Thank you, Philippa. There's another question here from Tom Slevin, who also says thank you for the talk, really, really interesting. He says his research has involved issues around the representation of the body and how fashions and sartorial changes have oppressed and liberated the female body and embodying representing cultural values. So his question is around if or how historical changes in clothing for a sport reflect the cultural attitudes or myths towards gender and the attitudes towards what a body should or could be and do. So for cricket or horse riding, have there been significant moments whereby female bodies have been enabled and mobilised by what they wear? And do they link to identifiable cultural values and attitudes?
So in terms of dress in women's sport, that is a significant issue. And I think, my quote from the Women's Cricket Association and about women's skirts, that, the fact that women played in skirts, and I think they played in skirts probably till the 1990s, I think. But it wasn't just that you know, wore skirts. The skirts had to be a certain length, and you know, so dress and appropriate dress has played a significant part in terms of the history of women's involvement in sport. And that does link to cultural values and attitudes. And one of the things that I draw out in the Women's Cricket and Global Processes book is the relationship between women accessing, I mean, the book is about cricket, but more broadly sport, the relationship between women's access to sport and things like education. And that there tends to be a relationship between those two instances, so that when women have access to education, that's how they had access to cricket and sport. There, in terms of other cultural values and broader gender relations, that there is a relationship between the two. So even the formation of the Women's Cricket Association in 1926 was not far after other sports for women had a governing body, and that was very much in relation to women getting the vote and the suffragette movement, that it came, you know, the fact that those things happened simultaneously impacted on sort of women's involvement in broader social life and therefore sport. So absolutely, there have been significant moments. In female jockeys, it's slightly different, and the work that we did around horse racing is quite interesting, because on the surface, equestrian sports seem like a perfect situation of equality, because men and women participate in the same races on the same playing field. But actually, what we find, and actually, you know, some of the myths around female jockeys are very much in sort of relation to the fact that actually they're participating on the same field, so to speak. So the issue for female jockeys was much more that they were actually banned from having licenses until 1975 and 1976 for what we call national hunt jockeys. So there are differences in different sports as well.
Great, thank you, Philippa. There's a question here from Darren Kerr, who also says, great talk. Thanks, Philippa. He was very taken with the ale, cake and ribbons as reward. But what excuses have sporting organisations given for differences in prize money and financial support in women's sports?
Yeah, it's a good question, Darren. I don't know if there's any prizes today for the ale, cake and ribbons, but well, we can consider that. In terms of, I mean, that is interesting. It comes across quite in a lot of the media reports of sort of women's cricket of that time, that they were the main prizes. The excuses for sporting organisations and different prize money has varied in different sports, but generally the argument has been about men's sport having more revenue. People are more interested in watching men's sports, and therefore they have more prize money. That has been the general excuse. But that's where the gender pay gap, and I mean, I didn't talk about that there is also a bonus, a gender bonus gap data in men's sport as well, which is really interesting to look at. And in many of those sports, the bonus pay gap is nearly 100%, that women don't actually get a bonus for working in a lot of sports organisations. But in terms of actual participation and athletes, the excuse is normally that men's sport brings in more money. There has been a move, so for the 100 in women in cricket, men and women will have the same prize money. And there was quite a lot of media focus on that, but actually how much they get paid to play in the 100 is significantly different, although the prize money is the same.
Thanks, Philippa. Andy, I'm going to ask you if it would be possible for you to unmute a couple of those in the audience who have questions. So Brian McDonough and Karen would also like to ask something if that's possible. Whilst you're just getting that sorted, there is a question here from Sam Punch. Great presentation, thank you. Have you come across similar discourses around women's brains as well as their bodies? For mind sports, we found that many myths about women's brains perpetuate and are reproduced by both men and women.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting, Sam, and that doesn't surprise me. I guess in some of the sports that I've studied, it's been more the physical body, but actually in cricket it's less pronounced because it has been more about the physical body. But there was discussions about women's ability to cope with a test match, so the 5-day test match, because of the emphasis on their bodies, but also their brains, whether they would have the tactical, and the concentration to be able to play for 5 days. So I guess there's a parallel there, but I'd be interested to hear more about Sam's research, because that would be really interesting.
Thank you, Brian. I think you are unmuted, so do go ahead.
I can't hear Brian, sorry. I don't know if everyone else can. Okay. Brian, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me at all?
Yes, Karen,
yes,
you can.
Hear
Why
you,
don't you go ahead?
Okay, I was about to type actually. I first of all, I had an observation, and the only sports team that I can think of that isn't split is Quidditch, and it's not even real, which I think that's quite a strange thing. It's just fictitious. But it's going to be a spot the psychologist now, Philippa, because I was wondering the extent to which these myths impact on girls and women in terms of perhaps their self-esteem, their feelings of ability to perform, being good at what they do, and those sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I've done to Quidditch. My oldest daughter's really into Harry Potter. She's going through that Harry Potter stage, as they do. And so Quidditch has actually become a real sport, which I think is difficult for a lot of people to conceptualise, because obviously it's Quidditch without broomsticks. But it is based on the principle, actually, that you have male and female, the same number of men and females in a team. In terms of what you're saying about self-esteem, yes. I mean, in sociology, we probably discuss it slightly differently, but it's similar sort of theme. So in my research, I talk about the internalisation of how women internalise these ideas about women's bodies, and that came across in all the research that I've done, and came across really strongly in the jockey research, because that also included trainers, female trainers, who also said that there were some horses they wouldn't put females on. They were just too risky for women to ride in case they got injured. And in the book, I talk about this internalisation and sort of the social habitus of females, and how they negotiate their involvement in sport, whilst also perhaps sometimes internalising some of these ideas and myths themselves.
Great, thank you. Brian, I don't know if you want to have another go and see if we can hear you. No. Maybe put it in the chat and we'll have a go that way. In the meantime, Matthew Fleet asks, what are your thoughts on Title IX in the USA to prohibit sex-based discrimination in any education program that receives government money?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discussion in this in the sort of gender and sport literature, because Title IX obviously had a huge influence for those who are not aware, I think it's 1972, Title IX, but basically it outlines that any education institution has to equally fund men and women's sports. And it has had significant success in the American context, but in the American context, there is more money in educational sport anyway. And it has made a difference. But one of the ways that some colleges got round Title IX wasn't particularly helpful for women's sports. So I think some legislation around supporting men and women's sport equally would help. And we could certainly learn from Title IX as a way of adopting some of those principles, I think.
Great, thank you. And there's a question here from Mary Farron. Really fantastic presentation, thank you. Very interesting topic. I find myself drawing on similarities between how women's bodies are currently perceived in female bodybuilding, wherein women are displaying the absolute ability to develop their body in the same way as men can, and are often met with negative comments about their body.
Yeah, I mean, Mary's right. I mean, and there is, you know, quite a lot of research around female bodybuilding, and the sort of challenge, I guess, to that very feminine body. Although it's worth saying in terms of taking that processual and historic approach, that actually our perceptions of the ideal female body have changed historically over time as well. But interestingly, one of the things that I drew out recently in some of the changes around women's sport has been that the ideal body image for women in sport has supported a sort of very thin, weak, almost looking body, when these are actually quite strong athletes. So it's the sports where, you know, women are quite petite or very thin that have become more aesthetic, I think, to people watching women's sport, which is quite interesting. So there's some really, you know, interesting research around, particularly from a sort of feminist sport perspective, on the roles of things like bodybuilding and also women's involvement in, you know, the strongest man events, and which are sort of challenging, I think, those perceptions of female fragility.
That's great, thank you, Philippa. I'm really reluctant to bring this to a close, but I am conscious of the time. Perhaps we can just squeeze in one last question, if that's okay, and then what I'll do is hand back to Di just to close the session for today. So from Natalie Norrit, thank you, Philippa, for a really interesting and engaging talk. When you reflect upon the research you've done and compared to when you first started research in this area, do you get a sense that anything has changed regarding the inclusion of women in sport?
Absolutely, yes. And a really good example of that is, so in 2017, I was really lucky to go to Lords to watch England win their World Cup against India. And I had my oldest daughter, Molly, with me, and my dad with me, because he'd really, my love of cricket came from watching cricket with my dad. So the three of us went off to Lords in 2017, packed to see Lords full to watch the game. And that in itself was you know, amazing, because when I started researching women's cricket, that there wasn't that level of interest. But what surprised me a couple of days later was there was something on the news about men playing cricket, and Molly said, she turned around to me and said, Mummy, do you know that men play cricket too? And I thought, you know, so if anything, you know, encapsulates that, I think for me that was you know, an amazing moment for me. Shall we take Brian's questions?
I think we should.
In the chat as the last question.
Yeah, I think we should. I think having finally got there, Brian. So Brian says, fascinating discussion. Horse racing is quite unique, I think, because women are competing with men against men, unlike football and cricket. And they're not only competing, but in many cases outperforming men. Holly Doyle, Bryony Frost and Rachel Blackmore are top of the list for jockey bookings. What explains this, if I'm asking the right question? Why is this not happening in other sports? Are there other sports where women are outperforming men?
So I could flippantly say that their bottoms are the right shape, right? To bring it back to the title of the question, I think that's a really interesting analysis, actually, because particularly for the different histories of those jockeys, and I guess in the equestrian world, and it wasn't a world that I was familiar with when I went to study it, so that was even more fascinating to me. I'm not even really a horse person, so it was a fascinating space to learn about. And one of the things that came across was it's about the horse, really. So when women are successful jockeys, it's about the horse. When they're not successful, it's because their bottoms are not the right shape or other myths. And maybe that's a good place to end them.
I think, Philippa, that's a fantastic place to end. So taking us around to the beginning of your title, I just want to finally thank you, Philippa. I mean, it's generated so much debate, which I'm sure will carry on beyond your presentation. So thank you. I know it's not easy doing this sort of thing on screen, but thank you for that. And I also want to thank the research office who are putting together these fantastic series of talks, really highlighting the research that we are doing at Solent University. And finally, but not least, thank you to colleagues internal to our organisation, to Solent, and externally who've joined us today. So thank you all very much, and we will end there. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.